Good morning, everybody. I hope that you had an excellent opportunity to refresh your memory about the first three parts of the class. We are now entering the third part of the class. We will be examining remedies. Today, we will first begin talking about the theory of remedies. Then we will proceed to talk about different types of remedies to racial and ethnic economic equality. And then we will discuss the law of remedies on racial discrimination. And finally, we will touch bases on the topic of the economics of remedies. So to give you a sense of what we'll be doing over the next few weeks, next week we'll talk about affirmative action, anti-discrimination, equal opportunity. April 20th, we will discuss the remedy of diversity. And then April 27th, we'll have a visitor, and we will discuss anti-racism, reparations, and reconciliation. At the end of class on April 27th, we'll have an exam, and the last day of class on May 4th, we'll have a debate. At the end of the exam on April 27th, we'll have the assignment to prepare you for the debates. So I'd like to begin now talking about the analytical framework for evaluating remedies. So we began by asking the question, what is the problem that a remedy is designed to solve? Why are we attempting to solve this problem? In other words, what is the justification for the remedy? And then there are two critical questions that we want to raise whenever we are attempting to evaluate remedies. One question is the remedy fair? Of course, that requires us to have some understanding of what we mean by fair. The second question is the remedy efficient? One reason why we should be concerned about the efficiency of remedies is that not all remedies produce the same results at the same cost. So it's reasonable to ask the question, does a remedy exist that can produce the same result but at a lower cost? In other words, is there a more efficient way of achieving a particular result? So are there other remedies that can achieve the same results that are more fair or more efficient? So that's one way of thinking through whether or not, when we evaluate remedies, do we have a metric, do we have a methodology for assessing the effectiveness, the fairness, and efficiency of remedies? So let me begin now by kind of summarizing the different types of remedies. The dominant form of remedy throughout the post-1960s era, after 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the years between the late 60s and the mid-80s, the dominant remedy was a race-conscious remedy. And an illustration of race-conscious remedy would be a scholarship program that is limited to racial and ethnic minority group members, or a recruitment program or an admissions program that provides benefits only to members of underrepresented minority groups. So the heyday, the height of the race-conscious remedies in the form of affirmative action occurred between the late 70s, the mid to late 70s to the late 1980s. And so this type of affirmative action, race-conscious affirmative action, could be in the form of direct subsidies, for example, subsidies to minority business enterprises that two firms both bid on a contract. The lowest bidder wins the contract, but a price subsidy to the minority bidder provides that minority bidder with an advantage. Another example of a race-conscious program would be a summer program that is designed to provide skills and tools, workshops, mentoring for minority students. Now you may say, well, what's so objectionable about having a summer program? Well, if the criterion for selection into the summer program is that you must be a member of a racial ethnic minority group, then that type of program is deemed to be a race-conscious program. Now, the first point I want to make is that race-conscious programs are a dominant form of affirmative action, but they're also a lightning rod for affirmative action. And it's principally because by targeting participants, by using as a selection criterion race or ethnicity, you immediately appear to discriminate against groups that are not included in the program. And so that's offensive, because the purpose of the race-conscious program, the purpose of the affirmative action program is to remedy discrimination. And the offense to the majority is, how can you justify having a discriminatory program in order to eliminate discrimination, in order to reduce discrimination? So the first of the two types of remedies is called a race-conscious remedy. Then you have race-neutral remedies. Race-neutral remedies are remedies that do not specifically target racial ethnic minority group members, but target the indicator, target a correlate of race and ethnicity. And so an example might be a program that targets individuals with low income. To the extent that racial minority group members have low income, or they're disproportionately found among those who have low income, it's conceivable that a low-income program will have a disproportionate share of participants who are racial or ethnic minority group members. But that doesn't necessarily guarantee that participants will be racial or ethnic minority group members. So one of the weaknesses of race-neutral remedies is that you have no guarantee that the group that you really want to help is the group that is helped. So another example of a race-neutral remedy would be a top 10% program. So suppose you have segregated high schools, and let's suppose that you're a state like Texas where most of the racial minority group members are heavily segregated in large inner-city public high schools. And the University of Texas admits the top 10% for all the students from the high schools. So that would include the top 10% of a high school with 100 graduates from some small rural West Texas town. And so that's 10 people from that small rural Texas, West Texas town, which might be an all-white town. And then 10% of a graduating class of 3,000 from a huge inner-city high school where 80% of the students in that high school are Latinos or African Americans. Now, 10% of 3,000 is going to produce far more graduates who are automatically admitted to University of Texas than 10% of 100. Now, what's very interesting is that although 80% of the students at this large urban inner city high school may be Latino or African American, it's not necessarily the case that the top 10% at the inner city high school are African American. It may well be that the top 10% are disproportionately from other racial groups. So another type of race-neutral program is a program that targets place. For example, suppose that we decide that we want to invest in renovating the housing and improving the schools and providing capital for small businesses. But we don't want to focus on the race or ethnicity of the recipient because we want a race-neutral program. So instead, we focus on the place, those places that have the highest concentration of people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So an example of a race-neutral program would be an empowerment zone. So you're targeting the poverty of the place and not the race of the people who live in that particular place. So let me talk briefly about the legal issue that's involved in race-conscious and race-neutral programs. Race-conscious remedies have the potential for infringing on the 14th Amendment rights. Thus, these race-conscious remedies must meet a strict scrutiny test. So the strict scrutiny test has the following prongs. One prong of the strict scrutiny test is a compelling state interest prong. Another prong of the strict scrutiny test is the narrow tailoring prong. Let me begin with the compelling state interest. In order to establish a compelling state interest, the remedy must redress prior or ongoing discrimination. So this is one way of meeting the compelling state interest. What is the compelling state interest for having a race-conscious program? One compelling state interest is to remedy prior or ongoing discrimination. If that's the compelling state interest, then you must have persuasive, conclusive evidence of prior or ongoing discrimination. A second possible compelling state interest, one that's currently being challenged in the United States Supreme Court, is the interest of providing diversity, a diversity that increases overall quality. Now, in the Gratz versus Bollinger and the Guter versus Bollinger Supreme Court cases in 2003, the Supreme Court held that the University of Michigan had a compelling state interest for its race-conscious admissions policy based on the view that the University of Michigan's students, white students, benefited from attending a school that was diverse. Well, that's a tricky argument to make because some of the diversity that is achieved by expanding racial ethnic composition is also diversity that's achieved by having difference in philosophical perspective, difference in political belief, differences in religion, differences in ideology. And so if it's diversity that produces cognitive gains associated with the learning activities at a university, then why racial ethnic diversity alone and not sexual orientation diversity, diversity of religion, diversity of views, diversity of political persuasion, as well as other forms of diversity. So in some respects, we've opened up a whole new argument against using race and ethnicity alone for the purpose of diversity, the moment that we try to make the case that the compelling state interest is in the cognitive gains that students achieve from being in a classroom with more diverse populations. A third type compelling state interest is that there is a requirement for obtaining government subsidies. Now, this is actually the weakest of all of the compelling state interests. In this particular instance, the state is a recipient of federal funding. The federal government has determined that there must be diversity, there must be affirmative action, there must be race-conscious expenditure of funds. Well, the reason why this is weak is that the federal government eventually will be sued, and the federal government will have to justify having its race-conscious program. So, three types of compelling state interests. One, a compelling state interest in order to remedy prior or ongoing discrimination. Two, a compelling state interest by virtue that diversity produces cognitive gains, or diversity produces net social benefits. And the third, that the compelling state interest rests on the fact that the state, here I mean the state government or the local government, will lose money that is targeted to state and local governments that manage to allocate some share of those dollars to women and minority-owned business enterprises or to racial or ethnic minority groups. So with that backdrop, let's talk a bit about the key legal theories. Jonathan, did we talk about these theories once before in class? So the two legal theories are the disparate impact theory and the disparate treatment theory. The disparate impact theory, yeah, I think we did talk about this once before.
But not a lot.
Okay, so the disparate impact theory is a theory that has a very low burden of proof on a plaintiff, and as a result has a low compensation, low monetary damages that will be awarded if a plaintiff wins. And then the disparate treatment theory has a very high burden of proof on the plaintiff, but very large potential benefits. So one thing I missed here is I missed the discussion of narrow tailoring. So if you go back to my discussion about the strict scrutiny test, one prong of the strict scrutiny test is the compelling state interest. The second prong is narrow tailoring. And if you're attempting to meet the first prong of the strict scrutiny, and that's the compelling state interest, then you can meet that prong through establishment that there's discrimination. But what is discrimination? And there are two main theories, legal theories of discrimination. There's the disparate impact theory and there's the disparate treatment theory. But let me go back to the second prong. And so the second prong is narrow tailoring. So suppose, just for the sake of argument, that we've established compelling state interest. We've established that indeed we have justifications for having a race-conscious program. Let's suppose that the way we were able to establish that we have justifications for having a race-conscious program is by demonstrating that there is past or ongoing discrimination. Then the remedy has to remedy that discrimination. So narrow tailoring means that the remedy must remedy the underlying problem that justifies the remedy. So if the problem that we're trying to remedy is discrimination in loans, so let me give you an example of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1975, indicates that you cannot discriminate against a loan applicant based on their race, color, creed, religion, or the gender. can't discriminate based on their income. You can't discriminate based on their risk level. You can't discriminate based on their likelihood to repay the loan. But you cannot simply say that we don't make loans to women, or we don't make loans to Latinos. So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act provides a legal basis for a remedy in the sense that if there is discrimination, then a plaintiff can prove that there's discrimination and then seek a remedy. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act provides a data source for identifying whether or not there's discrimination. So number one, let's assume that we have an allegation of discrimination. Number two, let's assume that we've collected Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data and we've been able to show that there's a consistent pattern of discrimination. So that means that we have a compelling interest for having a remedy. But suppose that the remedy that we suggest is a remedy that says that the bank must donate money for the building of a sports stadium, and the bank must provide subsidies to sports teams. And see, here's the fuzzy point. What's the relationship between the history and pattern of discrimination in loan denial rates and the stadium and sports teams? So although you may say that there's some sort of hope that by building the stadium there'll be more jobs for inner city residents, that by building the stadium that there'll be opportunities for more inner city businesses to compete and to build the stadium, there's only a remote relationship between the remedy itself and the underlying problem that justifies the remedy. So that's one important component of narrow tailoring. Another important component of narrow tailoring is that it must not be over-inclusive. So suppose that I demonstrate that there's discrimination against African Americans, as in the case of the city of Richmond, which was the capital of the Confederacy, which was a city that had millions and millions of dollars of contracts that were public contracts that were let out annually to white-owned business enterprises where the majority of people living in the city were African American. And African Americans had only a tiny, tiny share of the dollars awarded to their companies. So the first point is that there is a pattern and a practice suggesting that African Americans were discriminated against, or that African Americans were blocked from opportunities to compete with the white-owned business enterprises in the city of Richmond. The problem is that the city of Richmond passed a law that required that 30% of the contracts, or 30% of the contract dollars would go to Aleut, Eskimo, Hispanic, African American, Asian. In other words, virtually every, and women, virtually every group except white men. And Sandra Day O'Connor wrote in her majority opinion in Croson versus City of Richmond that nobody's ever established that Aleuts and Eskimos were discriminated against by the city of Richmond. And so this program was over-inclusive. So if you're going to have a race-conscious remedy, that race-conscious remedy has to be narrowly tailored to the specific problem that the remedy is expected to remedy. In addition, narrow tailoring implies that program is flexible. So if I do have a race-conscious remedy, it targets a particular group, and it targets that group for a particular point in time, and it turns out that things change, that the program should be flexible enough in order to be able to change as the conditions change. In addition, narrow tailoring suggests that a program can't be permanent, that the program is a temporary intervention designed to remedy the underlying problem. Once the problem is remedied, then the remedy is no longer justified. A final and important component of narrow tailoring is that there must be a minimum racial preference possible to achieve the compelling state interest. So there are two different ways of thinking about this. One way is that it's the least restrictive of the possible remedies, or that it's the least burdensome alternative. So a lot of different ways of conceptualizing the minimum racial preference. So here's the point. Narrow tailoring, aside from saying that it must remedy the problem that it's designed to remedy, it can't be over-inclusive, that it must be flexible, that it must not be permanent. In addition to those factors, the other critical component is that it should minimize the race preference portion. So in order to justify having a race-conscious program, the race-conscious portion must be minimized. So let me give an example, an illustration of a narrow tailoring of an affirmative action program or a race-conscious remedy. This is the program of the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Highway Authority that indicates that recipients of federal fundings must have a disadvantaged business enterprise program. The disadvantaged business enterprise program must establish a goal. The goal must be established according to a measure of the relative availability of willing, able, qualified, disadvantaged business enterprises. That goal, however, can be adjusted up depending on the presence of discrimination. So if 5% of all the firms in the geographic market area are disadvantaged business enterprises, there's some discrimination in the marketplace, then you can adjust upward that 5% in order to create an adjusted goal. So the FTA, the United States Department of Transportation, has identified a set of steps that recipients of federal funding must undertake in order to justify having a disadvantaged business enterprise program. One of those steps, one component of the program, is the certification of firms as being disadvantaged business enterprise. And in a nutshell, a disadvantaged business enterprise is a company that meets two different criteria. One is social disadvantage, and the second is economic disadvantage. Let me deal first with economic disadvantage. So the economic disadvantage is based on two critical measures. One, the net worth of the firm. It used to be $750,000 net worth. That is less your personal residence and subtracting out your equity on your business enterprise. And the second is your revenues. And the revenues is calibrated by the particular industry that you're in. So that's the economic disadvantage, meaning that you have relatively low net worth and you have low sales or revenues. And then the second indicator is social disadvantage. Women and racial and ethnic minority group members are presumptively members of or socially disadvantaged individuals. But if you're not a woman, if you're not a member of a racial or ethnic minority group, then you can establish your disadvantage. For example, suppose that you're disabled, suppose that you are a veteran, suppose that you are a resident of a depressed area, then you can establish your social disability. So here's kind of the definition of the disadvantaged business enterprise.